Hi, welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I'm Gary Machuda, and this is the third video of a three-part series on Josephus and the Old Testament canon. In part one, we looked at what's called the canonical interpretation. It's found in a work called Against Apion in Book 1, paragraphs 38 through 41. Protestants often appeal to Josephus singling out 22 books as him giving a canonical list, a canon, if you will, fixed canon of the sacred books of the Jews. And they note that since it ends with Artaxerxes, it does not include the later Deuterocanonical books, or what Protestants call the Apocrypha. And in our first video, we saw how even when you describe the canonical interpretation, you see that you have to import all sorts of categories and terms that are completely alien to Josephus and foreign to his arguments in Against Apion. And this should signal us that perhaps the canonical interpretation is being read into Josephus. It's really not being drawn from the text itself. So if Josephus wasn't singling out the 22 books as a closed, fixed canon of the Old Testament, then why did he single out these 22 books? And we answered that in video 2. We looked at the purpose and the argumentation Josephus makes in Against Apion. We showed how he develops his argument about what constitutes the best histories or historiography. He debunks the reliability of the earliest Greek historians, because the whole purpose of Against Apion was to refute the claim that the Jews were not an ancient race because they were not mentioned by the most renowned Greek historians. That brings up paragraphs 38 through 41. In this, he shows that the 22 books, he singles those out, not because it's a fixed, inspired canon, the limits of the sacred books of the Jews, but because the 22 books represent the best historiography that just so happens to record the time from the creation of man all the way through the time of Xerxes to his successor Artaxerxes. So in other words, he vindicates what he wrote in Antiquities of the Jews by showing that the 22 books that record the most ancient histories of the Jews are impeccable. So in this video, we're going to take a different approach. We're going to show that our interpretation much better coheres with what Josephus says about the sacred books of the Jews, not only in Against Apion, but in his other works as well, the Antiquities of the Jews and the Jewish Wars. So we're going to look at all his statements about what he says elsewhere about the sacred scripture. We're going to show how our interpretation coheres perfectly with them, and how the canonical interpretation doesn't fit at all. It's like trying to squeeze a square peg into a round hole. Let's begin our Apocrypha apocalypse. Let's begin by looking at the sacred books of the Jews and the work Antiquities of the Jews. Whenever Josephus talks about scripture as a whole, he often uses the word sacred books or sacred writings. Sometimes it's translated sacred scripture. And he claims numerous times that his work, Antiquities of the Jews, was written on the basis of the sacred books, the sacred writings. He makes this claim numerous times. Now, if the 22 books in Against Apion represent the entirety of the sacred books of the Jews, then we run into a problem, because if Antiquities is based on the sacred books of the Jews, and the sacred books of the Jews are these 22 books that end at the time of Artaxerxes, then we would expect to find that Antiquities of the Jews would only chronicle the history of the Jews from the creation of man to the time of Artaxerxes. But that isn't where Antiquities of the Jews ends. It continues on through the Maccabean period and even into Josephus's own time. So the extent of the Antiquities of the Jews is far greater than the 22 books that the canonical interpretation singles out. It appears that the sacred books extend even further. Josephus repeatedly says Antiquities is based on the sacred books. Then I think it follows that the sacred books continued on past Artaxerxes through the Maccabean period, maybe even into Josephus's own time. But is that really possible? Well, in Against Apion 129, Josephus makes an interesting statement that's easy to skip over. He's talking about how the non-Greek cultures were very careful in how they treat, they compose, and they preserve their sacred histories. And he says that we Jews actually take even greater care of the histories. In 29, he says that the task for caring for these records were assigned to, quote, the chief priest and prophets, and how this has been maintained with great precision down to our own time, unquote. That's interesting. The prophets and chief priests continue to take care of scriptures down to his own time, the time of Josephus. Well, again, that is another thing that doesn't fit very well, because if prophet written history ceased at Artaxerxes, how can he say that prophets continued to take care of these books up to his own time? Now, someone may say, sure, but he's talking only about the care of sacred scriptures. He's not saying that the sacred books of the Jews contain the history all the way to his own time. Well, that's true, but he does say that elsewhere. So let's look back at Antiquities of the Jews. This is in Book 1, and he says something very interesting. He's talking about the Septuagint and the legend that surrounds how the Septuagint started. Basically, King Ptolemy in Egypt petitioned the chief priest to provide some scribes to translate the Jewish law into Greek for the famed Library of Alexandria. And so Josephus is talking about this chief priest who acquiesced and did it, and hence began the Septuagint. He compares him to himself. Now, notice what he says, quote, "And I truly thought that it was fitting for myself to emulate the magnanimity of the high priest, and to suppose that even now there are many who are eager for knowledge similar to the king. For not even he anticipated me in obtaining the entire scripture, but those who were sent to Alexandria to translate it transmitted only this portion alone, namely of the law," unquote. So he's saying the chief priest only gave the law, the first 5 books of Moses. That was all that was translated. So Josephus is going to outdo him, and he's going to give the entire scripture in Antiquities of the Jews. That's interesting. So how much history is he going to give based on the sacred books, the entire sacred books, the entire scriptures? Well, in the very next line, he says in paragraph 13, quote, "Countless are the things revealed through the sacred scriptures, since indeed the history of 5,000 years is embraced in them." So the entire history, the entire scripture of the Jews encompasses 5,000 years. Here's the problem. According to the canonical interpretation, if there's only 22 books of history that go up to the time of Artaxerxes, this falls well short of 5,000 years. In fact, John Barclay, in his translation and commentary on Against Apion, tells us, quote, "Josephus is here speaking in approximate terms. According to Josephus's own reckoning, 4,306 years elapsed from the creation of the world until the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE. 4,719 years until the death of Judah the Maccabee, and 4,977 years until the publication of Antiquities. If Josephus did believe that the sacred writings terminated with Artaxerxes, then his statement that 5,000 years of history are comprised of the sacred books would be an incredibly gross over-exaggeration, since 5,000 years is a lot more than what's found in the 22 books. But if he believed that the sacred books continue, let's say, to the time of the Maccabees, this would just be an approximation, since it was only 4,719 years that were covered. So it's off by a couple of centuries. If Josephus believed that he himself was contributing and extending the sacred histories of the Jews, then it's really just a matter of rounding off numbers, because all he does is round off to the nearest century. Again, this coheres perfectly with our interpretation, but it does not fit with the canonical interpretation. Scholars are forced to say he's over-exaggerating, and grossly over-exaggerating, how much history is contained in the 22 books, if you believe the 22 books is actually a canon. Now, someone may say, well, fine, maybe in Antiquities, he's speaking in generalities. He really didn't care about accuracy. After all, he's writing to pagans. What do they know? But once it comes to Against Apion, and the pagans start saying that they don't believe this early history he gave, well, then Josephus puts on his scholarly cap, and then he pronounces very specifically about the canon being reduced to 22 books. So maybe, yeah, in Antiquities, it was a gross approximation, a gross exaggeration, really. But in Against Apion, that's where he abandons that idea and gives us the true canon of Scripture. The problem is that Josephus repeats all this at the very beginning of Against Apion. In Apion 1:1, he says that the Antiquities that he wrote was based on the sacred books and that it encompasses 5,000 years of history. Exactly what he says in Antiquities. So he hasn't abandoned this position. And in fact, the very reason that he states at the outset that it covers 5,000 years shows that to narrow it down to the 22 books really causes quite a bit of tension within Against Apion if you're going to insist that he's giving a canon. If, however, you hold to our interpretation, there really is no tension whatsoever. In fact, it fits quite well. So we have several indications that the sacred books of the Jews extended far beyond Artaxerxes and encompassed 5,000 years, and that Antiquities of the Jews shows that. But we have other evidence as well. For example, in his introduction to the Jewish Wars, he talks about where he's going to pick up his historical narrative. And he says something really interesting in Book 1, paragraph 18. After talking about how it would be superfluous to go through the whole of history, he says this: I shall begin my work at the point where the historians of these events and our prophets conclude. Of the subsequent history, I shall describe the incidents of the war through which I lived in all detail and elaboration at my command. For the events preceding my lifetime, I shall be content with a brief summary. So he's saying, I'm going to pick up my narrative where the prophets conclude. Now remember, Against Apion 137, only prophets can write history. So he's talking about the last prophet-written history available. But he doesn't pick up his narrative at the time of Artaxerxes. That would be superfluous, like he says earlier. But rather, he picks it up during the Maccabean period. That is the period where he summarizes right up to where he comes on the scene and he can give firsthand account. Again, this is a tantalizing clue that for Josephus, prophet-written history continued after Artaxerxes, all the way through at least the Maccabean period, and it may have even included himself. And we've seen hints at this elsewhere. For example, when he says that the chief priest and prophets continued down to our own time in Against Apion. Josephus may have believed himself to be a person capable of writing prophet-written history, and that his own works could potentially at least be included along with the sacred histories of the Jews. Now, this is a whole side argument and a totally different issue. But I think it's important to note this because if Josephus really did believe this, and several scholars believe it's true, or at least plausible, it loans credibility to our interpretation because it shows that the 22 books aren't exclusive and it doesn't cut off the possibility of other sacred writings being written after Artaxerxes. However, it does show that the canonical interpretation could be problematic. It doesn't quite fit well with what these scholars believe Josephus understood his purpose in writing to be. But it's interesting that there are these hints that not only prophet-written history continued, but prophets and prophecy did as well. Now, there are some people who hold that a very hard view of the canonical interpretation, that after the 22 books, after the time of Artaxerxes, all prophets and prophecy ceased in Israel. And so it's impossible to have prophets after the time of Artaxerxes. And a number of them have done detailed studies about how Josephus uses the word prophet or the title prophet in his writings. And sure enough, before Artaxerxes, he calls lots of people prophets, but it's pretty rare after Artaxerxes that he talks about somebody being a prophet. But the fact of the matter is that even if he identifies one person as a prophet, this, I think, is a defeater for the hard interpretation, the hard canonical interpretation, because obviously prophecy couldn't cease if there was a bona fide prophet after the time of Artaxerxes. And it might be worth just taking a couple of seconds to note that Josephus does give us an unmistakable description of a post-Artaxerxes prophet living, and that is the man John Hyrcanus. John Hyrcanus lived during the time of the Maccabees, and Josephus says of him in his Jewish War, "He it was who alone had three of the most desirable things in the world, the government of his nation, and the high priesthood, and the gift of prophecy. For the deity conversed with him, and he was not ignorant of anything that was to come afterwards, insomuch as he foresaw and foretold that his two eldest sons would not continue masters of the government. And it will highly deserve our narration to describe their catastrophe and how far inferior these men were to their father in felicity." You can see here an unquestionable affirmation of John Hyrcanus as a prophet. He says that he has the gift of prophecy. He says that God himself conversed with John Hyrcanus, and he also had predictive prophecies about his son. All of these take place in the Maccabean period, a time when, according to the hard canonical interpretation, all prophets and prophecy ceased. Well, Josephus apparently didn't believe that. Now, some try to dismiss this as, well, this is what's called the bat kol, the daughter's voice, a kind of inferior form of prophecy that happened in the post-biblical period. So it's not really full-blown prophecy itself. But if you read this description, I find that interpretation hard to swallow. How can a bat kol receive the gift of prophecy? How could someone who's just getting the daughter's voice actually converse with the deity? These are very strong statements, and I think it's difficult to brush them aside as Josephus not seeing John Hyrcanus as a full-blown prophet. In addition to this, in Antiquities, Josephus also notes that the high priest's breastplate and the Urim and Thummim, now these were devices that God used to transmit the oracles to the chief priest. This is a prophetic instrument. He says that these devices ceased to shine at the death of John Hyrcanus. Again, not only do we have an identified prophet living in the Maccabean period, but Josephus also points out that these gifts of oracles, of prophecies, ceased during the Maccabean period, not during the time of Artaxerxes. Also, if you do a close study of the sources used by Josephus before and after Artaxerxes in his work Antiquities of the Jews, something surprising comes out. A careful study of antiquities shows that its author gives absolutely no indication that he changes from sacred sources to profane sources after the time of Artaxerxes. Now, one would expect that if Josephus switched from sacred to profane sources, that he would give some evidence or alert his reader in some way that a change has taken place. But he doesn't. It's absolutely seamless. He uses both sources and both time frames exactly alike. His historical narrative runs seamlessly from the pre-Artaxerxes period to the post-Artaxerxes period in Antiquities 11-296 through 297. The only difference is that the sources are continuous before Artaxerxes, and as we pointed out, afterwards it becomes discontinuous and a bit sporadic. In fact, Steve Mason, perhaps one of the best Josephine scholars out there, notes that, quote, if we lack the Against Apion, Josephus himself would offer a clear case for an open canon, but we do have Against Apion. Yes, if you look at all the other works, Antiquities of the Jews, the Wars, you would see Josephus seems to hold to an open canon, or at least a much larger canon than the Protestant canon. But as Steve Mason notes, that the canonical interpretation trumps all that. We do have Against Apion. And since we know that this must be a canon, the 22-book canon, then that becomes kind of like a paradigm that's used to reinterpret or dismiss all the other evidence to the contrary. Of course, that assumes the truth of the canonical interpretation. And I think this is actually a really good line of argument to show the canonical interpretation appears to be very artificial. If it was authentically Josephine, then we would expect it to cohere with everything else he wrote, just as we saw. And indeed, our interpretation coheres perfectly with everything we saw, but the canonical interpretation doesn't. And so, since we do have the canonical interpretation, that trumps everything Josephus says about the extent of the sacred histories, the sacred books, the sacred scriptures of the Jews everywhere else. This also leads to our final point, that not only does the canonical interpretation not cohere with what Josephus says about the sacred books elsewhere, but it also makes him the odd man out for the period. Many scholars have shown that this period of the first century all the way through to about the second Christian century, the boundaries of scripture were fluid for the Jews. In other words, there wasn't a universally recognized fixed canon during this period. That's something that happens much later, well after the time of Josephus. But if Josephus is giving, as the canonical interpretation suggests, a fixed 22-book canon that's recognized by all, his claims do not fit at all with his contemporaries. So not only does the canonical interpretation force Josephus against what he wrote in Against Apion, but it also forces him against what he wrote in all his other works, and it forces him to be idiosyncratic within his own time period. Again, none of this is necessary because our interpretation coheres both with Against Apion, with Antiquities, with Wars, and also with what we found in the period. It fits like a hand in the glove. It's really forcing the canonical interpretation, or as we saw in our first video, reading into Josephus, a fixed canon, that really produces this train wreck of tensions within the work of Josephus, and also Josephus with all the other contemporary evidence we have. Now, I wish I could say that this was a case found only with Josephus alone, but it isn't. In every other field of study, not just in terms of the canon, but literary, scientific, what have you, the preponderance of the evidence rules. And if you have some evidence, outlying evidence that contradicts the preponderance, then either you take a close critical look at why that minority evidence is saying what it's saying, or you dismiss it out of hand. That's true in every field, except when it comes to the Protestant Old Testament canon. Only here do you have a minority subsuming the majority or dismissing or displacing the preponderance of the evidence. In other words, we have a preponderance of evidence from Josephus, both in Against Apion and elsewhere, that he held to, and the Jews held to, a much wider, more encompassing collection of sacred books than just what the canonical interpretation says. But since the canonical interpretation is there, that trumps everything else, and everything has to subsume under or be dismissed or radically reinterpreted to fit what he says in that small paragraph in this one work. This is true for Josephus, but it's also true with many other church fathers as well, where the insistence that they're giving a definitive statement right here in a few lines in a particular work, and everything else has to be squeezed into, or that square peg has to be squeezed into the round hole of their other writings, or they just ignore the round hole altogether. You see this with Cyril of Jerusalem. You see this with the Origin of Alexandria. You see this with Athanasius and many others. So Josephus just happens to be one of several examples of where coherence is brushed aside and really something becomes absolutized. The canonical interpretation becomes a kind of trump card that trumps all the other evidence written by that particular person. We don't have to do that, folks, because our interpretation coheres perfectly with what Josephus says everywhere else. It fits perfectly with his contemporaries. He doesn't have to be strange. He doesn't have to be idiosyncratic. He doesn't have to be at war with himself or at war with what he writes elsewhere. I think this adds a tremendous strength to the plausibility of our interpretation. So we went through a lot of data. In fact, there is a lot in Josephus that we haven't even touched on. So perhaps in some future video, I will address that as well. But hopefully it'll give you some food for thought that perhaps Josephus isn't really saying what we think, or we're really making him try to say. And with that, I hope you have a great day, and God willing, we'll talk again soon. Bye-bye. Thank you so much for watching. And if you haven't done already, please subscribe, like, do all those social media type things because we appreciate it. Also, if you'd like to support me on Patreon, look me up by my name, Gary Machuda, and you will have access to a lot of other information, in-depth research, not only on the Deuterocanon, but other topics as well, like Mary, Purgatory, all sorts of things. So check it out, folks. And again, thank you so much for watching. And God willing, we'll be back again soon. Bye-bye.